Hello everyone, my name is John Sierra and I am a Tolkien scholar, and my camera is a bit off-center, so let me go ahead and adjust that. There we go, that's a lot better. And I'm the kind of guy that you come to if you have any kind of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, any of his works, the man himself. I can answer your questions and talk your ear off about the minutiae, the lore, the meaning and everything about Tolkien. It's a passion of mine and has been for a long time. And of course we have a bunch of questions. By the way, the music's slightly different. This is actually the soundtrack to the old Super Nintendo game, The Lord of the Rings. And I actually recently played through it twice, actually. Once I played through it for my Twitch channel. That was more really just for fun and sort of a project I'm doing involving role-playing games. But I wanted to play through it again specifically for the Tolkien channel, the Tolkien Scholar channel, so I did do that, stopping to pause to talk about the lore and what it got right and what it didn't get right and all this sort of, it's very interesting. I said based on the films, really. It was before the Peter Jackson films, although it has like a slight connection to the Ralph Bakshi film, and we're going to be seeing content from that coming out in the next few weeks, and so I recorded the whole thing for this channel, not for the gaming channel. I do have a gaming channel, but it's a very different vibe there. So anyway, as it's been tradition, I have a lot of questions. I believe something like 18 or 19 questions. Although you know what it was, I believe there was 19 questions, but I'm sort of combining two of them are very similar into one, because the answer for two of them is very similar. But anyway, I'm going to do a brief reading, as we have been wont to do, and today I will be reading from the Silmarillion, and I'm going to read a bit of the. My book ribbon there. The chapter of the Voyage of the Earendil. Yet Earendil saw no hope left in the lands of Middle-earth, and he turned again in despair and came not home, but sought back once more to Valinor, with Elwing at his side. He stood now most often at the prow of Thingol, and the Silmaril was bound upon his brow, and ever its light grew greater as they drew into the west. And the wise have said that it was by reason of the power of that holy jewel that they came in time to waters that no vessel save those of the tLotR had known. And they came to the enchanted isles and escaped their enchantment. And they came into the shadowy seas and passed their shadows. And they looked upon tLotR, the lonely isle, but tarried not. And at last they cast anchor at the bay of Eldamar, and the tLotR saw the coming of that ship out of the east, and they were amazed, gazing from afar upon the light of the Silmaril, and it was very great. Then Earendil, first of living men, landed on the immortal shores, and he spoke there to Elwing and to those that were with him. And they were 3 mariners who had sailed all the seas beside him. Falathar, Erelond, and Arondir were their names. And Earendil said to them, Here none but myself shall set foot, lest ye fall under the wrath of the Valar. But that peril I will take on myself alone, for the sake of the 2 kindreds. But Elwing answered, Then would our paths be sundered forever. But all thy perils I will take on myself also. And she leaped into the white foam and ran towards him. But Earendil was sorrowful, for he feared the anger of the lords of the west upon any of Middle-earth that should dare to pass the leaguer of Aemon. And there they bade farewell to the companions of their voyage, and were taken for them forever. Then Earendil said to Elwing, Await me here, for one only may bring the message that is my fate to bear. And he went up alone into the land, and came to the Calakiria. And it seemed to him empty and silent, for even as Morgoth and Ungoliant came in ages past, so now Earendil had come at a time of festival, and well nigh all the elven folk were gone to Valimar, or were gathered in the halls of Manwë upon Tanaquetil, and few were left to keep watch upon the halls of Tirion. But some there were who saw him from afar, and the great light that he bore, and they went in haste to Valimar. But Earendil climbed the green hill of Tuna, and found it bare. And he entered into the streets of Tirion, and they were empty. And his heart was heavy, for he feared that some evil had come even to the Blessed Realm. He walked in the deserted ways of Tirion, and the dust upon his raiment and his shoes was a dust of diamonds. And he shone and glistened as he climbed the long white stairs. And he called aloud in many tongues, both of elves and men, but there were none to answer him. Therefore he turned back at last toward the sea. But even as he took the shoreward road, one stood upon the hill and called to him in a great voice, crying, Hail, Earendil, of mariners most renowned, the look for that earneth of unawares, the longed for there cometh beyond hope. Hail, Earendil, bearer of light before the sun and moon, splendor of the children of earth, star in the darkness, jewel in the sunset, radiant in the morning. That voice was the voice of Eanwe, herald of Manwe, and he came from Valimar, and summoned Earendil to come before the powers of Arda. And Earendil went into Valinor and to the halls of Valimar, and never again set foot upon the lands of men. Then the Valar took counsel together, and they summoned Ulmo from the deeps of the sea. And Earendil stood before their faces, and delivered the errand of the two kindreds. Pardon he asked for the tLotR, and pity for their great sorrows, and mercy upon men and elves, and succour in their need. And his prayer was granted. I have to stop because I could just keep reading that forever. I could just go on and read the whole Silmarillion to you guys, but that would be bad. We can't do that. Let's get to your questions. So we have, like I said, we have 18 questions here. There's really 19, but 2 of them were pretty much the same answer, so I wanted to include both of them to give credit to the 2 people who asked me very similar questions and give an answer. So let's start with starting with the beginning is usually a good place to start. And we have a question here from Luke Cohen, who asks, who is Khamul, the Black Easterling in The Lord of the Rings? Khamul is one of the 9 Nazgul, or ring wraiths, and he's the only one that we know the name of. I mean, we know the Witch King, but that's not his given name. That's an epithet, that's a title. Khamul is the second in command to the Witch King, and is the Nazgul most prominently featured in Book 1 of The Lord of the Rings. He is the Black Rider that speaks to Sam's father, Hamfast Gamgee, a conversation that Frodo overhears, which is what prompts him to leave Hobbiton sooner than he had planned. He also attempted to question Farmer Maggot, who was not very cooperative. Khamul is usually said to be an Easterling, though it's an assumption, it's a very strong assumption. Out of the 9, it was said that 3 of them were men of Numenor, so the rest must be from Middle-earth. And as Sauron had power in Rhûn, it seems logical to assume that at least some of them were Easterlings. Unfinished Tales does refer to him as a Black Easterling, though some people have interpreted Khamul's identity as ambiguous because the term Easterling could just mean anybody from the east, and it could be just referring to Dol Guldur as being an eastern fortress. But he probably was from Rhûn. He probably was an Easterling. Okay. All right, next question. This one is from Jack Fraser, who asks, why were there multiple Elvish languages instead of just Quenya? Elvish language evolution and diversification should be impossible since they are immortal, and therefore the language should remain remembered and unchanged. They are immortal, but that doesn't mean what you think it means. It means that they basically have all the time in the world to develop their language. Quenya was not even the original language, as all Elvish languages, the chief being Quenya and Sindarin, but there are many others. There's tLotR, for example, and there's a bunch of them. There's the language of the Avari, and I don't think all of the Avari even spoke the same language, but all of the language of the elves derived from Quendi, ancient Quendi, it's called. So, by your logic, no elf should speak Quenya. No elf should speak anything but the original Quendi. But Quendi was primitive. It was a primitive tongue, and it needed to be developed. As the elves separated, the elves of Aman developed Quendi into Quenya, and the Sindar elves developed Sindarin. There was also tLotR. Cultures will develop languages over time. It doesn't matter how many actual generations passed. They will find needs of words. They will find need of words. They will find need of phrases to describe new things and new experiences. Because whether it's the same elf that was alive 1,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago, or a distant descendant, eventually there's going to be a situation where we don't have a word for that. And people in one part of the world are going to come up with a word for that, and people in another part of the world may come up with a different word for that. So the fact that they have different cultures at all is the reason that you would see a different language, because they also want their languages to sound a certain way, and the Avari elves are very different from the Sindar elves, who are very different from the Noldor elves, who are different from the tLotR elves. They're all going to want to have their own way of life, and that includes languages. So that's why there are different languages for Elvish. Okay, next question. This one's from Skulk, who asks, if Frodo had managed to destroy the ring and all three had been rescued, would Gollum have been able to start healing? So basically, you're asking, in a hypothetical scenario, Frodo is able to just drop the ring in, or maybe Gollum does still attack him because he's not able to really not do that, and in the tussle the ring winds up in the fire, but Gollum does not, and he survives. What happens to Gollum? Does he heal? Does he become better? I believe that the only healing that Gollum could have after this would have to be the Undying Lands. He would have to go there. And I'm not really sure that they would welcome him. The loss of the One Ring was so damaging to Frodo that even with Arwen's jewel, he still experienced pain. And he would not recover from the Morgul wound. He would not recover from Shelob's poison fully without sailing west. All of the mortals that were allowed to sail west, and we're going to talk about them in another question later on, are some of the greatest heroes: Tuor, Bilbo, Frodo, Sam, Gimli. Gollum is not a hero. He's a mass-murdering, baby-eating lunatic. He is deserving of pity, but whether or not he could be forgiven, well, that's between him and Iluvatar. But I don't see the Valar allowing him in their realm, even if Gandalf begged on his behalf. And I want to point out that Gollum had become so wretched that he couldn't even touch a bit of Elvish-made rope without it burning him. He would not be able to handle the inherent goodness of the Undying Lands. So, and I don't mean like the supposed holy death rays that some people have spoken of, because that's very much not a thing, but just the fact that he's so wretched, it would be cruel to bring him there, I think. Gollum surviving the War of the Ring would be cruel in general. It would be much crueler than his actual fate. So I don't think there would be healing for him now. And that's probably why Tolkien chose to kill him off in the end, because I think he saw it as a mercy. Okay, next question. This is from Blair Colquhoun. I hope I'm saying that right. What happens to this is from the one from the thumbnail. Here we go. I didn't clickbait you too bad. We got into it with only, let's see how far, 13 minutes in. What happens to the Shire in the Fourth Age after Frodo sails west? What happens to the Shire? So the Shire actually got a bit bigger, and it remained autonomous. So Aragorn was not just the king of Gondor, he was also the king of Arnor, which technically means he's also the king of the Shire, because it's in a part of Arnor called Arthedain. But he allowed it to govern itself as it had been in the same fashion since King Argoleb II disappeared, and the Shire had adopted the laws of King Argoleb II as their own. Aragorn did expand the borders of the Shire. Buckland, which was Shire adjacent, but not really part of the Shire, it became an official part of the Shire. And Westmarch, which was mostly empty at that point, but the Shire was going to grow. There were going to be more hobbits, so they needed room to expand. So Westmarch was added to the borders. And I believe that after some time, the Red Book came to be, it's because it's called the Red Book of Westmarch, because Sam's family moved there. His daughter Elenor married the Hobbit who would become the first warden of Westmarch, so it became known as the Book of Westmarch, even though it was written in Bywater. So after the scouring of the Shire, Aragorn also instituted a ban on men. the race of men were no longer allowed in the Shire, and even Aragorn, being the king, abided this rule. He met his hobbit friends outside of the Shire. The Gamgees became the most well-known and prominent family, though their surname changed. They were no longer the Gamgees, they were the Gardeners. Will Whitfoot stepped down as mayor of Michel Delving. Samwise was elected an unprecedented 7 times in a row, and those are 7-year terms, so it's 49 years as mayor, and each term was consecutive. There was no breaks in there. Peregrine, Pippin, he became the Thane, though he spent the last portion of his life in Gondor, and his son Faramir took over as Thane. I think that basically covers it. Okay, next question. This is from Serge Elia. I hope I'm saying that right. And Serge asks, it is said that Smaug is the main antagonist of The Hobbit, and yet he only occurred in 2 scenes. Would it be better, or wouldn't it be better, if he were featured in The Lord of the Rings and allied himself with Sauron? It sounds cool when you say it, but I would ask then at that point, what would be the resolution of The Hobbit? Tolkien did not write The Hobbit with a particular plan for a sequel. He did, put a few things in there, like Gandalf mentioning a necromancer in the forest, and that may become the main villain of a second entry, which is indeed what happened, because that necromancer was Sauron. But Tolkien did not have The Lord of the Rings planned out when he wrote The Hobbit, so he had the Silmarillion planned out, or at least a framework of it in stories like The Children of Húrin and Beren and Luthien, but they were not connected to The Hobbit. So leaving Smaug alive to team up with the necromancer in his second book was not part of his plans, nor did he plan to replace the character of Tevildo from Beren and Luthien with a necromancer named Thu. He did do that, and then Thu later became known as Gorthaur the Cruel, which is Sauron the Abhorred. So he didn't plan that when he wrote The Hobbit. It came later. All this stuff came later. He didn't plan that Sauron, from his mythological work, was the same as the necromancer at first, nor that the Perilous Realm, which is what he called the Undying Lands at the time, would be connected to the Land of Faerie that Bilbo mentioned in The Hobbit, and of course that it would all coalesce into the Undying Lands. So Tolkien was writing a standalone story about a Hobbit. It should be clear that Smaug is not the main antagonist, though. You mentioned he's only in 2 scenes, and that's correct. He's the distant danger. He only appears at the very end of the book. Surely he's the great force of evil that it prevents Thorin from being king under the mountain, but the fact that the story goes on for quite a bit after the dragon's demise, and that the main protagonist, Bilbo, has really not much at all to do with the dragon's death. The true evil in The Hobbit is greed. Not a dragon, but in a way, the dragon represents greed. He sleeps on a pile of gold, of which he makes no use. Thorin's greed is even called dragon sickness. So if Smaug had been left alive, how would The Hobbit end? It would be a very vague, cliffhanger, unsatisfying ending with sort of a sequel bait. And I think if he had done it that way, The Lord of the Rings would have been a smaller scale story that would have had nothing to do with the Silmarillion, and we wouldn't have this big shared universe, I think. So I think that, I think he wrote it the right way, is what I'm saying. Okay, so these next 2 questions are the 2 that are sort of connected to each other. So, let's see. Caleb Patterson asked me, how would a human die if they were to reach Valinor? Would Eru simply erase them from existence? And then another person who remained anonymous asked, what are some of the non-elf characters that made it into Valinor in The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit series? So really, for the second question and the first question, you can't, they go together, because I have to talk about all of the non-immortals, the non-elves that went to Valinor, or to Aemon, the Undying Lands, I should say. And then we'll talk about what really would happen to them. So first, let's list them off. First of all, we have Tuor. And there's a major caveat with Tuor. He was a mortal man who did sail west, but the Elvish tradition held that he was made immortal upon making that journey, and therefore became an elf. Now, I do include him in this list because he was born Adan, of the Edain, a man, a mortal man. But I have always had the thought that immortality and being an elf and the Undying Lands, that was all his destiny. It was all supposed to happen. Then we have Earendil and Elwing. Another caveat there. They also became immortal because they had Elvish ancestry. Earendil's father, Tuor, was a man, but his mother, Idril, was an elf. And Elwing, her father, was what was his Berin's son? I can't think of his name right off the top of my head, but he was a man. But the mother, Nimloth, she was an elf. So they were given mercy, and they were also made into elves because they were half elves anyway, and that's why there's that choice of Earendil and Elwing to be elves, and it was visited upon their sons, Elros and Elrond, and Elros chose to be a man, and Elrond chose to be an elf. There were also some other mariners who went west with them, but did not actually step onto the Undying Lands. As a matter of fact, Earendil wanted to go alone. He didn't want Elwing to come with him. Elwing was like, we're not being separated. But the others went back. They did not actually reach the Undying Lands. Then we have Amandil. Amandil was a man of Numenor, and there's a caveat here as well, because we don't actually know what happened to him. And that's really the other question, is what happens to mortal men who are not afforded some sort of mercy or some sort of loophole. Amandil is the perfect example. He sailed to the Undying Lands to pray to Manwë to save Numenor from the plotting of Sauron and Pharazôn. But he was never seen again, and we don't know what happened to him. We don't know if he made it to Aemon, and we don't know if he did make it to Aemon, what happened after that. Then we have Pharazôn of Numenor, along with a fleet's worth of Numenorian men. So we're not only including the king here, Pharazôn, but also a lot of other men of Numenor. We know what happened to them. They were destroyed. They definitely stepped onto Arda. They cleared Tol Eressëa. They beheld Taniquetil. They stepped onto the beach at Aemon, and they were destroyed by the Akalabeth. Now, we know for a fact that while they reached the shores of Aemon, they did not come to Valinor, but they did come to the Blessed Realm. The Dagorath prophecy did state that they would return to fight Morgoth, but that's neither here nor there. Now, obviously, the Akalabeth can't happen every time. This was specifically not just because men had stepped foot on Aemon, but they stepped there with the intent of war. They were coming there to make war upon the Valar, so that's why it was such an extreme response. Next, we have Frodo and Bilbo Baggins. I'm including them together because they left together. Now, they were ring bearers, and they were heroes of the Third Age, and they were invited to the Undying Lands. We do not know if they specifically came to Valinor, or if they came to Eldamar, or if they lived in Eressëa. We don't know. We just know that they left, because that was the end of their journey. Next, we have Samwise. I'm including him separately because he left later. He was a ring bearer as well, even though he was briefly a ring bearer. He was certainly a hero of the Third Age. His trip was delayed. He didn't go with Bilbo and Frodo because he still had a life to live in Middle-earth. He had a wife and he had children, and he didn't leave until much, much later. And then we have Gimli. Gimli did not depart from Mithlond like all of these others, but he departed from the bay south of Gondor in a ship that was made by Legolas. We do not know how he obtained the grace to travel west. It was most likely allowed by Manwë after hearing prayers from the likes of Galadriel and Aloran. But what actually happens? So, hold on 1 second. I'm on the wrong thing here. Here it is. Okay. So, only a handful of mortals were allowed to sail west. But what happens to guys like Amandil, who did not have permission to go? They were not going with Amandil did not go with evil intent, and I believe he wasn't alone either. I think he took a few others with him as well, but he was the only one that was named. What happens to Amandil? We don't actually know. So we do know that the punishment is supposed to be death. But how does that actually work, is the real question here. Do they actually execute mortals who come to Aman? I don't really think it works that way, because every mortal man has an allotted time in Arda. And if they are killed before their allotted time is up, they have to wait. They don't depart from the world immediately. They go to Maedhros and wait out their time there. And then, so basically, if it's your destiny to live and die when you're, let's say, 83 years old, right? But then somebody kills you when you're 40, you have another 43 years to wait in Maedhros before you pass from the world and you go beyond Arda and you meet a tLotR and all that. So if you were somebody like Earendil who just came to Valinor and spoke to Manwë, and then they said, well, we got to kill you, all that's going to do is put him in Maedhros. So it's probably like, why would they bother doing that? They probably just put him in Maedhros, and he had to wait out the rest of his natural life. That's probably how it worked. We don't, of course, know, because according to Tolkien, he was never seen again. He was never heard from again. We don't know. But I can't see them bringing him to, like the square in Tirion and cutting his head off, and then his soul goes over to Maedhros and sits there for however long his life is supposed to be. It seems a bit theatrical and a bit brutal when they can just say, well, you have to stay in Maedhros until you die. So I think that's probably what happened. Okay. Next question. This is from Michael Brett, who asks, why did Sauron send the Mouth of Sauron to meet with Aragorn and his army instead of sending an army himself? I don't really understand how you could come to the conclusion that he didn't send an army. In large-scale battles, it is typical to have moments of palaver, whether it is during the battle or before the battle. We saw this with Aragorn negotiating with the orcs at Helm's Deep, and we saw it between Gandalf and the Witch King at Pelennor Fields. The Black Gate was a more formal example. A diplomat was sent out, the Mouth of Sauron. Of course, believing that Sauron had no army present would ignore the battle that happened right after the Mouth retreated. You may ask, of course, well, why did Sauron even send out a diplomat? Why would he not just send the army out? But let's read the passage. I'm going to read you the passage from The Return of the King. Then the messenger of Mordor laughed no more. His face was twisted with amazement and anger at the likes of some wild beast that, as it crouches on its prey, is smitten on the muzzle with a stinging rod. Rage filled him, and his mouth slavered, and shapeless sounds of fury came strangling from his throat. But he looked at the fell faces of the captains and their deadly eyes, and fear overcame his wrath. He gave a great cry and turned, leaped upon his steed, and with his company galloped madly back to Cirith Gurgur. But as they went, his soldiers blew their horns in signal long arranged. And even before they came to the gate, Sauron sprang his trap. Sprang the trap. That's what he's doing. That's what Sauron's doing here. The Mouth is speaking with Aragorn, is speaking with Gandalf, and all that time is mostly speaking with Gandalf. Aragorn just stared him down. Sauron's troops were getting into position. So it was all arranged. It was all to sort of ambush them in a way. Okay. This next question, I'm actually going to save this for a little bit later. Let me put that over here. Okay, so, next question. Oh, this is a fun one. I always like talking about the linguistic aspects here. So this one was asked by Unseen Walker. What is the basis for male hobbit names? Female hobbit names generally use flowers, but the males, Bingo, Bungo, Bilbo, where do these names come from and why? It is true that female hobbit names tend to be floral. Male hobbit names don't have any apparent initial meaning. You get names like Frodo, Bilbo, but this is due to the fact that the names were said to be sort of awkwardly translated from their tongue, Westron, or Hobbitish Westron, which I suppose is a specific dialect of Westron, into English. So let's talk about the primary Hobbit characters. Frodo is an example. Frodo was a translation. In English it's Frodo, but in Westron it's Maura, which means wise. So in coming up with a linguistic reason to translate Maura into Frodo, Tolkien's rationale was Maura is derived from the Westron word maur, which means wisdom. So the Germanic equivalent would be Frod. So Maura becomes Frodo. Not all Hobbit names are equal, though. Let's talk about Bilbo. Bilbo was said to be Hobbitish, which is, like I said, probably a specific regional dialect of Westron. And the original name is very similar, Bilba. So Bilba becomes Bilbo, but no meaning was provided for Bilbo or Bilba. Pippin, Peregrine, his Westron name is Razanaur. It's got like somewhat of a Latin inspiration there, and it means wanderer. So it's Englished as Peregrine or Pippin, which is meant to resemble the word pilgrim. So you could see where, well, okay, so Razanaur means wanderer. Wanderer and pilgrim are somewhat synonymous. So pilgrim will do a word that sounds like that, Peregrine, and we'll call him Pippin as a nickname. Meriadoc, or Merry, is his name in Westron is Kalamak. It's derived from Kali, which means merry, as in mirth and happiness. So you could see exactly how that works. The most interesting of them is Samwise. Samwise is a tradition of Banazir, and Banazir means half-minded. That's actually in Gondor Sindarin, or rather in Gondor Sindarin, Aragorn refers to him as Perhale, which means half-minded. So you could see Perhale is the same meaning in Sindarin or Gondor Sindarin as Banazir is in Hobbitish. But how do we get from half-minded to Samwise? And I want to mention that Aragorn makes a note here in his letter. It's called the King's Letter, that Perhale, which means half-minded, he says that Sam's a better name for him should be Panhale, which means full-minded. So you can see where that's sort of Englished. Per, like in percent, half, pan, as in Pangea, all. He's saying that, Samwise's name basically translates to half-wit. And Aragorn's note is saying he shouldn't be called that. He should have a more respectful name because he's actually incredibly smart and resourceful and courageous and all these things. He shouldn't be called that. So Tolkien did not give us a rationale as to how Banazir becomes Samwise. Now, wise, obviously, that's the mind part, but how does half become Sam? Now, somebody else in the comments here, I can't seem to find it. It must have been on one of the shared posts. Mentioned that Sam could be derived from some, as in, but I don't think some is added up. So I don't know if that's the exact rationale. Tolkien didn't really give us a rationale for Sam. You can see where wise comes from, though. But the origin of Sam is mysterious. That's the best I could do for you. Okay, next question. This one's anonymous. Was Smeagol ever an orc before he became Gollum? No, Smeagol's not an orc. He was a hobbit, actually. He was a Storish hobbit from a tribe known as the River People. They dwelled near the Anduin River. The ring was fished up from there by his friend and relation Thingol, as Smeagol murdered him, and had a disagreement over who gets to keep the ring. So as a river store, he would not really know the word hobbit, because hobbit was mostly used to describe a different type of hobbit, halfling rather, called Harfoots. And they dwelled in holes. Hobbit is derived from an Old English word, holbithla, which means hole dweller. So he probably wouldn't have made a connection between himself and Bilbo, or himself and Frodo, or Sam. Because even if he did realize that they were similar to what he used to be, he'd mostly forgotten his past. Okay. Next question. This one is from Peter Ramirez, who asks, assuming Gandalf thought Bilbo's ring was one of the 19 rings of power, or even some random magic ring, not of the 20, shouldn't the fact that it made Bilbo invisible have been a major indicator that it might be the One Ring. Gandalf wasn't too sure that it was even a ring of power at first. He was greatly concerned with its effects. Upon finding out that Bilbo had a magic ring, Gandalf was concerned because ringcraft was really only ever done by two parties. There was Sauron, who created the One Ring, and the Elves of Eregion, chiefly Celebrimbor, who created the Rings of Power with the magic taught to them by Sauron. Having a Ring of Power himself, Gandalf was aware of the innate power of the rings, but as Bilbo's ring just seemed to turn him invisible, which is, like a parlor trick, Gandalf hoped that it was one of the lesser rings, which were basically practice attempts at making rings of power. They didn't have any kind of major power. They might be dangerous, but Gandalf was not really sure about that. Now, where Gandalf became very suspicious, though, was Bilbo's story of how he obtained the ring. He told a story about winning it in a riddle contest with a creature named Gollum. Bilbo's normally an honest person, and like most people who are honest, he was very bad at lying, and Gandalf saw right through it. When finally finding out that Bilbo actually just found the ring lying on the ground, Gandalf had to wonder, why would he lie? And he thought, well, maybe the ring has some sort of hold on him and he's trying to legitimize his claim. And it's very similar to the way that Gollum's rationale worked. He called it that was his birthday present because he got it on his birthday. He was concentrating on the fact that he got something nice on his birthday and ignoring the fact that he had murdered someone to get it. The ring made Bilbo deceptive where he normally would not have been. Even if it was a poor attempt at deception, it was concerning to Gandalf. And then, of course, later on, he noticed Bilbo stopped aging. This is where he became extremely concerned that it was definitely a ring of power and not a lesser ring. And he did have some fear that it could be the One Ring, but the odds were against that. Saruman assured him that the One Ring was lost forever, surely washed out to sea by the Anduin River. In seeing the immense difficulty that Bilbo had giving up the ring and leaving it to Frodo, Gandalf's concerns were now sky high. And finding Isildur's own account of the One, which described it as not having a gem, whereas all the Rings of Power had gems, and it would show Sauron's description when exposed to great heat, he was able to prove the ring's identity at last. So invisibility, I need to just briefly touch on that. It was not as unique as you might think. Gandalf actually mentions other people using Rings of Power to become invisible and eventually becoming wraiths. So the fact that it made Bilbo or Frodo invisible was not a clear indication of it being the One Ring at the time. There were a lot of other indicators, though. Okay, another one about the ring specifically. This was asked by Zoidberg. Why not Zoidberg? I get this one a lot. Why could Bilbo wear the ring all the time, but when Frodo did, they could finger him? And this seems interesting because when you read The Lord of the Rings, or you watch the films, it's very urgent, and they tell Frodo never wear the ring, and it seems that every time he wears the ring, the forces of Sauron just sort of immediately hone in on him. But that never happened to Bilbo. Because during Bilbo's time with the ring, Sauron wasn't looking for it. And that's what it really comes down to. Sauron's forces, and independently Saruman, had been searching for the ring specifically in the area around Gladden Fields, because that's where it was last seen. And unknown to all parties, it was where Thingol and Smeagol had found it, but they didn't know about that. Sauron believed that the ring was lost forever, while Saruman thought it must be somewhere around the Gladden Fields. But the accounts of the actual location of Isildur's death were incorrect, as seen in this passage I'm going to read you from Unfinished Tales. When men considered this secret hoard more closely, they were dismayed, for it seemed to them that these things, and certainly the Elendilmere, could not have been found unless they had been upon Isildur's body when he sank. But if that had been in the deep water of strong flow, they would have in time been swept afar away. Therefore Isildur must have fallen not into the deep stream, but into shallow water no more than shoulder high. Why then, though an age had passed, were there no traces of his bones? Had Saruman found them and scorned them, burned them with dishonor in one of his furnaces? If that were so, it was a shameful deed, but not his worst. So previously, because there were no actual witnesses to Isildur's death, but a lot of the story of the disaster of Gladden Fields is surmise. It's strong surmise, but it's surmise nonetheless. It had previously been believed that Isildur fell into deep water and was washed away, because the people who wrote this account believed that he would not have reached the western shore. If he had reached the western shore, he would have eluded the Watchers. However, they were incorrect, as he had died coming to the western bank, and he lay in rather shallow water. His remains were later found and disposed of by Saruman. So anyway, back to the case in point. Due to the belief that Isildur died in deep water and his body was likely washed further downstream, perhaps into the sea, it was believed that the ring was gone. This is why the likes of Gollum and Bilbo and Isildur were able to freely use it. Nobody was looking for it. There were no Nazgul patrolling, looking for the ring. However, when the ring passed to Frodo at this point, he didn't really use it. He kept it in a drawer at first, mostly forgotten, as Gandalf advised, but by the time Frodo found himself having need of it, and carrying it around regularly and leaving on his journey, Sauron had captured and tortured Gollum and found out that his ring had been found. So due to Gollum's interrogation, Sauron knew that there were creatures called hobbits, and that one of them was named Baggins and had the One Ring. Of course, he didn't know the difference between Bilbo and Frodo, but that didn't matter. After some time finding out where the hobbits live, where's the Shire, he sent the Nazgul to retrieve it. So the long and short of it is that it was hazardous for Frodo to use the One Ring, specifically because Sauron's forces were actively looking for a hobbit named Baggins who would have the One Ring. Okay, next question. This is an anonymous one. Who was Earendil's father? I've touched on this very briefly. Earendil's father is actually one of my favorite characters in the whole of the Legendarium, tLotR of Gondolin. So tLotR was the son of Huor, and he was the house of Hador. He was the nephew of the great hero Hurin, who, like his cousin Turin, he was fostered in Brethil. He fled the Battle of Sudden Flame, the Dagor Bragollach, and he came to the sea. And he was the first man to see the ocean, and he was struck by the unquiet of Ulmo, the sea longing, and that was unusual. And I touched on this very briefly, about how I feel he was always meant to become an elf, that he was basically an elf born in the body of a man. The urge to sail to Valinor, the unquiet of Ulmo, the sea longing, it was only meant to be imparted to elves, not men. And tLotR was said to be as fair as an elf, and he was revered by the swans. They led him to a cave with elvish raiment and elvish weapons that he took up. He met Ulmo at the sea, and he was the only man to directly meet a Vala, other than Morgoth, of course, who told him to travel to Gondolin with a message for the king, Turgon. So tLotR, he came to live in Gondolin. He fell in love with the princess there, Idril. They had a son, Earendil. So Turgon told him that through the union of tLotR and Idril, Middle-earth would be saved by the birth of a new star. And that's why I chose the Silmarillion passage that I read to you earlier in my reading of Earendil coming to Valinor. He saved Middle-earth with his prayer there, and he became a star. He took his ship, this wonderful mithril ship, and the Silmaril into the sky, the Star of Earendil. So what happened to tLotR, though? He saved many lives in the fall of Gondolin, and he led the elves away. They came to be under the kingship of Gil-galad. tLotR became the first and only man to sail west by invitation. Given special grace by Iluvatar, the elves said that he was made immortal and counted among them. Okay. I'm coming to the end of the soundtrack here because this is the fight against the Balrog, so I might have to start it over again. I have a lot of questions today. Okay, so next one. This is from Jason Robinson, who asks, how come Gandalf, who would have had knowledge of the Stone Giants, never tried to use their service in the Battle of Life and Death, seeing as everything else had come, some fight within Tolkien's universe? It's alluded to in The Hobbit that the giants really had nothing to do with that. They didn't concern themselves with the wars of men and elves. The giants were a danger in The Hobbit simply because, they weren't being direct antagonists, but they were throwing boulders around as a game, which made the pass extremely dangerous. Gandalf mentioned later on that he would try to find one of the more decent giants to try to convince him to block up the entrance to Goblin Town with a big rock. It was never mentioned if Gandalf had ever managed to make that attempt or if it was successful, but Gandalf seemed to think that he might have to try several giants before finding one that would agree to do this. Trying to get them to fight in a war, that would be a waste of time. They likely would not put themselves in danger unless there was some sort of compensation for them. And due to the fact that, he said he would have to find one of the more decent ones, it's hinted that the giants just might not be all that nice, and that if it came down to it, they might have been on Sauron's side before they were on Gandalf's side. So there's that as well. Okay, let me just start that over. Okay, so we have music for the rest, but I only have a few left here. This one's anonymous. Gandalf also had power in his voice by using it to confuse the trolls Tom, Bert, and William in the book. He's referring to The Hobbit. Was this power similar to Saruman's, or was it just prestidigitation? So I don't think it was a magic power or a sort of special charisma like what Saruman used. And the word prestidigitation suggests illusion of some sort. The only illusion that you might take from it is maybe he was throwing his voice, but that's a skill that anybody could do. I think it was just a mundane imitation. Gandalf fooled the trolls not by using magic or trickery, but by imitating their voices, getting them to argue with each other and to lose track of time until the sunrise. This was better than trying any sort of direct attack or magic, because that would have placed Thorin and his party into jeopardy. Imitating voices is not a power, it's a skill. For example, I could do voices. I do voices all the time. I could do the Mark Hamill Joker from the Batman cartoons. That's not magical. You just say, "Why, hello there, Bats. How are you today? I'm having a silly of a time." That's not magic. That's just me doing a voice. I could do Meatwad. "Hello, Daryl. This isn't magic either." I could do Gollum. This isn't. My throat's a little rough right now. Let me just take a drink. I could do Gollum. I need Gollum juice, but I don't have Gollum juice. Gollum juice is like green tea with honey and ginger. Stupid fat Hobbit sizzler. Gollum. It's just imitation. A lot of people can do that. Gandalf might have been throwing his voice. That's akin to ventriloquism. It's not really magic or prestidigitation. You might say it's adjacent to prestidigitation, because it's possible that illusionists might use that. But I don't really think that was the intent that Tolkien had. Okay. Next question. When Sam finally went to Valinor after the death of his wife, do you think he would have been reunited with Frodo, or is it possible that Frodo would already have died of old age? I think it's possible that Frodo would have been alive. When Frodo sailed west, he was 53 years old, though physically his aging had been stunted by the One Ring. It was mentioned during the 17-year gap between Bilbo's departure that Frodo had stopped aging. And it caused a lot of muttering in the Shire, because Bilbo didn't age after he was 50, and then now Frodo turns 33, stops aging. So they were like, "Oh, well, some families have all the luck." This means that, Frodo was 50 years old during Lord of the Rings. Physically, he would be 33 years old, a very young hobbit that had just come of age. His aging would resume after the destruction of the One Ring, but he sailed west a few years later, so he physically would be 36 years old. So by comparison, Sam was 41. Now I'm going by Sam's age is a little bit in contest here. I'm going by the revised and corrected tale of years that would place Sam's age during the journey as 41 years old. And he had no age stunting. His possession of the One Ring was extremely short. Sam sailed west at the age of 102, 61 years later, and I find that number interesting. 61 years is also the amount of time that Bilbo had the ring. Anyway, Frodo would have been 114 years old at that time, which is well past the average lifespan of a hobbit, which is 100 years. But there were, of course, outliers. Gerontius had lived to be 130 years old without any sort of magical intervention there. So Frodo would physically be 97 years old. If he aged, there's sort of a question, we talked about this a little bit in the comments, there's sort of a question of whether he would age in the Undying Lands or not. Regardless, he wouldn't be immortal. but because he still had his allotted time, as I talked to earlier, but he may not have become incredibly old, but he would still have an allotted time. It's within the realm of possibility, though, that a very old Frodo, whether he appeared physically extremely old or not, I believe that he would appear old, may have greeted Sam there, and I'd like to think that it was in Frodo's nature to sort of hold on as long as he could to wait for Sam. Of course, not that was really up to him, all right, because we talk about the idea of mortals having an allotted time. Okay, next question. This is an anonymous one. In The Lord of the Rings, why did Frodo and Sam dislike Gollum while Gandalf seemed to feel some pity for him? So I think the question is a little too simplistic. I think it's a more complicated issue than that. I should point out that you can dislike someone and pity them. The two feelings they're not only not mutually exclusive, they tend to run together. Another point that I have to make is that no one likes Gollum. He's not a likable character, at least as not that we know him. We do know that there were only two people in his life ever that liked him, which would be his grandmother, who seems to be sort of the matriarch of his small community, who eventually did have to turn him out due to his constant mischief. And then there was Thingol, and he murdered Thingol. So he was shunned by his grandmother. He killed his only friend. Who is there to like Gollum? He's wretched and vile. He's a sneak thief. He's a cradle-robbing cannibal. Even Gandalf acknowledged that he deserved death. That doesn't mean that we can't pity him, which was sort of Gandalf's entire point. As vile as he is, he was also tortured by Sauron. And Gandalf, and therefore Tolkien, is taking a very hard stance against torture. No one deserves it. Frodo laments that Bilbo didn't slay Gollum, and Gandalf very rightly points out that if you cannot deal life to people who deserve it, why should you deal death to people who deserve it? Frodo didn't pity Gollum at this point, which is understandable, but Gandalf points out he's not met Gollum, he's not seen Gollum. Later on, when he does meet Gollum, he says to Sam that I've seen him and now I do pity him. He doesn't trust him, and he certainly doesn't like him, but he does pity him. Even Sam, whose heart was a lot harder than Frodo's towards Gollum because he was so protective of Frodo, he did feel some pity for Gollum. Aragorn also pitied Gollum, and he made it very clear that he did not like Gollum. He could not abide his presence, and he could not abide his smell. So I think that, yeah, part of it is that the question's too simple, and it seems to suggest that you can't pity someone and dislike them. And I think that the two go hand in hand more than you would think. Okay, just 1 second here. I just wanted to look at this real quick in the comments. Good. All right, let's see. We have 2 questions left. Okay, so this one is also anonymous. How long did the elves travel from Quivenian to Valinor? How long did that trip last? There's not really one answer because they didn't all leave at the same time and they didn't all arrive at the same time. And some of them didn't. They started the trip and didn't make it. But to answer it as best I can, of the elves that did leave Quivenian and start the Great Journey, which were then referred to as the tLotR, the journey started in the year 1105, the Years of the Trees. Not all of them went straight to Valinor. Some tarried, and some picked up the journey later. Some of them tarried because they wanted to, and some stayed, and then some continued on because they felt the urge to go west, and some because Sauron was messing with them. So they sort of split into a lot of different groups around this time. The Sundering of the Elves was going on. Olmo made 2 trips across the Sundering Sea, pushing tLotR with the Elvish pilgrims on it. He did it in 1132, and he did it again in 1150. Keep in mind, this is the Years of the Trees. Still, other elves would cross the sea by other methods later on, but the second trip was basically the final stage of the Great Journey. Eressëa came to its final resting place in the year 1151. where the tLotR sought to abide by the sea. So the journey across the sea was quite lengthy as well, because they started in 1150 and they arrived at 1151. So, considering that they left Cuiveanion in 1105, and then the final elves that took the Great Journey arrived in 1151, it's 46 years. However, these are years of the trees. They're longer years. The sun wasn't around, so we didn't count the years by the sun. We counted them by what was known as Valian years. The first age is sort of divided into two calendars. There's the years of the trees and the years of the sun. So Tolkien said that a Valian year was 9.5 solar years. So the journey from Cuiveanion to Aemon actually took 437 years. So that's quite shocking. Okay, let's see. Okay, and this one asks, and this is the one that I had decided to do later, and I had a reason for deciding to do it later, because I thought it might conflict with another question, and then I realized that question I did not include. I'll include it next time, though, because it has to do a lot with pronunciations. But anyway, this one is from Nerdmaster 200, who asks, why didn't Thingol join the Union of Maedhros? So Thingol swore never to fight alongside the Feanorians, so joining the Union would be going against his own oath. The Union of Maedhros was an unprecedented and very temporary alliance between elves, men, and dwarves. Some of the members would even raise eyebrows. There was Bor and Ulfang. They were Easterling chiefs. Most of the Easterling tribes had joined with Morgoth. Thingol, however, had a lot of bad blood with Feanor's sons. He remembered the blood of Beren and Luthien and the kinslayings. Thingol was surely not a perfect individual himself. He had a lot of issues. You might say that he had already dragged Doriath into the whole mess by requiring Beren to retrieve a Silmaril to marry his daughter. That mixed his land and his people in with the doom of the Noldor and the story of the Silmarils. And he kept a Silmaril that Maedhros had sworn to slay anyone to retrieve. So Doriath was not completely unrepresented in the Union, however, because Beleg and Moblung were there. They were from Doriath. So he didn't want to directly ally with the Feanorians, but he did send some elves there. So anyway, that's the last one. I did have a thought that I had one of the ones asking me how to pronounce certain names, and one of them was Maedhros. But I realized that was a question from today, so I'll be including it next week. But anyway, guys, if you've made it this far into the video, you certainly have enjoyed the content, because you sat there and watched 57 minutes of it. So I should say that if you haven't subscribed, you really should do that, and make sure you do the whole subscribe. It used to be on YouTube that you could just click subscribe and that was the end of it, but now you have to hit a bell and turn on notifications and all this stuff, and please try to make sure you do that. Hit the like button. That does help the video get recommended to more people, and leave some comments if you wish. And of course, if you want to ask a question to be included in a video, there is a link in the description to my Quora account. You can just hit ask, or you can ask a question on there and tag me. It's very easy to do. Or you can ask a question in the comments and I will answer you there. I will see you guys next time.